Hi everyone. This is the lecture that goes with the chapter 2 of the Schmidt and Lee readings. It's titled Processing Information and Making Decisions. So basically what we're going to talk about is how we process information in our brains, and then how do we make a decision about that information. In the last lecture, we learned how, actually the lecture before last, we learned how to classify skills, how to lump them into like categories. So I want you to think back to that first lecture when we discussed the difference between an open and a closed skill. So I want you to think to yourself, what is the definition of those two classifications, an open or a closed skill, and why is it different? So if you chose basically the framework of the environment, that is what the difference between an open and a closed skill is. So an open skill is in an environment that is always changing, so it's variable. And so the performer of that skill is going to have to adapt all the time to all of those changes within the environment. And a closed skill means that there is no change in the environment, and therefore the performer does not need to adapt to any changes. It's pretty much set in stone and can be repeated over and over again. So I also want you to think back to the difference between a discrete skill, a serial skill, and a continuous skill. See if you can come up with your own definition real quick. So a discrete skill is a type of skill that has a very defined beginning and ending. It starts and it finishes. These skills are typically brief in nature. And then a serial skill is essentially a bunch of, or several, discrete skills performed back to back in a serial manner. And this skill is going to be dependent on the sequence. And so it takes simpler discrete skills, puts them together into a more complex skill. And then continuous skill, if you remember this, an example would be just kind of a nebulous amount of running outside. This would be an example, and this is a continuous skill. Is essentially, it does not have a defined beginning and end. It just kind of keeps going and going and going, and it's a very arbitrary beginning and ending. So that was a quick review. So now let's move on. So no matter what the classification of a skill falls under, there's pretty much a general way that information flows through our body and allows us to perform that said skill. So I want you to think about these 4 stages that you see on the slide here as the basic framework we will use for the rest of the semester. We'll go deeper into these components, each 4 stages, but overall, this is basically how things happen. Number 1, sensory information enters our body via our eyes, our ears, nose, touch, proprioception, basically all of our sense organs. 2, this information from these sense organs is then processed, and a decision or a plan is made about that information. So this is the cognitive piece to this. This is all happening in your central nervous system. And then 3, the action is then taken, and the movement or the motor skill is performed, all based on the decision that the central nervous system picked. And then 4, then there is resulting feedback after the skill is performed, and it gives this performer information as to how well they actually achieved that skill. Were they off a little, or were they spot on? this lecture, we're going to talk a bit more about how we take in that input from various sources and then generate a decision as well as an action from that input. So here are our objectives. We're going to talk about the information processing approach for motor performance. We'll talk about what the stages are within that information processing approach. We're also going to talk about factors that influence the speed of that process. What makes us faster, what slows us down. We're going to talk about the role of anticipation and how that affects the speed of information processing. And then also the role our memory systems play in motor performance. Let's think about how a computer works. We type certain things in on our keyboard, like letters and symbols and spaces, and then the computer takes that input, organizes it according to programming rules, then it generates some sort of product for us in response to that input we entered. So that could be a document of some sort, or an image, or a task such as sending an email. And of course, computers are wicked smart, so the amount of input it can handle and the generated output it can produce is beyond what our minds can actually comprehend. But we work in a very similar way. When it comes to producing movement, it begins as input coming from our environment. Then our brain receives that input, organizes it according to programming rules, and then decides how to respond. And then this response signal is sent to the rest of our body, directing us in our movements. This is called the information processing approach. So if you look at this simplified figure on the left side of the slide, it outlines this approach. So information is presented to the human, that's the input part. The human then processes that information, that's the blue box. And then the output is the generated specific movements based on that input and that decision. Now on that figure that we just looked at, let's actually forget about the input and output for just a bit, and let's just focus on the human part of that flow chart. It's basically the blue box in the middle. So this part of the diagram is the most complex. So first of all, let's think about all the different information in the scenarios and the pictures on the slide. So starting out with the picture on the left, let's visualize we're a batter at home plate and we're about to have a pitch drawn to us. I want you to answer these questions, write these in your notes. What might be going through your mind at this point? And then what are some of the response possibilities of this situation? Now let's think about this picture on the right. Let's pretend we're Eli Tomac, professional motocross racer, and we're all lined up at the starting line anticipating the gate drop. What might be going through your mind in this scenario? You could imagine that there is a lot going on during that human part of the flow chart. The researchers have been able to break up that portion into three stages. These three stages are what get us from that input to the actual output. According to the information processing approach, these three stages do not overlap. Basically, stage 1 begins, then it ends. Stage 2 begins, then it ends. And then stage 3 begins, and then it ends. So when and only when one stage is completed, the result is passed on to the next stage. So these three stages that happen in that human box in between the input and output, they're called stimulus identification, response selection, and movement programming. Starting with stage 1, the stimulus identification stage, the task of this stage is to decide whether a stimulus has been presented, and if so, what is it? So I want you to think about some examples of a stimulus that you actually have incorporated in your life. What are some stimuli in your life that requires a response to it? Let's say you are a track athlete or a swimming athlete and you are about to begin your meet or your race and you have a gunshot. This is an example of a stimulus, the gunshot at the beginning of a race. Or if you play football, the snap of the football is the beginning of a play. Or if you drive a car, a red light on the road that you're driving on, this is also a stimulus. So all of these stimuli are noticed by our eyes, our ears, or by touch, or basically any other sensation. So this stage is primarily considered a sensory stage. We're using our senses to analyze environmental information and basically answering the question of what is that input the human is getting. That input might be the edges of an object, or the color of a light, or the direction of travel or speed of travel. If we go back to our visualization of being a baseball batter, our stimulus could be a fast pitch, or it could be a curveball. So in this stage, we're identifying if a stimulus exists and then deciding what is that stimulus. Stage 2 takes that information that was determined in stage 1 and decides what response is appropriate given the nature of the situation. Stage 1, the stimulus identification, was primarily a sensory process. However, stage 2 is where this process transitions from sensory over to motor. Sometimes a response to a situation can have options. Like, does the batter swing downward to generate a ground ball? Or does the batter swing upward, hoping to make it over the fence for a home run? Let's look at this example on the slide. If a deer runs out in front of your car, you have a few options on how you can respond. You could brake and slow down, you could swerve to avoid it, or you could just plow right into it. So let's think about the situation that might sway you to select, let's say, the response to brake and slow down. So in my example, if I was going slow enough and knew that I could brake, then maybe that would be my choice. Or if the deer is far enough away, then I would have time to brake and slow down and miss it. Or are the roads icy or is there traction? That might sway my decision to brake and slow down or not. So then let's think about the option to swerve. What situation might dictate you to choose that response? Well, if, say, there was plenty of room on the road, there were no other cars around, you could swerve. Or if the deer was going in a certain direction, you could swerve the opposite. And then the situation of hitting it, or the response of hitting it. Maybe in this situation, I've gotten so close to the deer and it was so sudden that braking and swerving were not even an option. Or maybe I have a big vehicle with a nice bumper and it's just safer to just plow into it than to move around it. Basically, this is the stage when all of that stimuli and input has been identified and a response has been selected on what to do given the situation. Using that example in the last slide, let's say we have selected the response to brake and slow down and not hit the deer. Now we actually have to put together what movements are necessary to generate that response. This is what's happening in stage 3. Mind you, no movement has been made yet. This is actually just where your brain determines how to organize the motor systems in order to make that desired movement. This requires recruitment of the right muscles in the appropriate sequence, in the timing that is suitable for the stimulus, and generating the correct amount of power. So this all takes organization ahead of time at the brain level before any movement occurs. That's essentially what's happening in the movement programming stage. Remember that figure from earlier where there was input, human, and output? And now let's replace that human square that was in the middle with the 3 stages that are happening in this process. So now we have input, which is our stimulus. Then we have stage 1, the stimulus identification stage. Stage 2, response selection. Stage 3, movement programming. And then finally, we have output, which is actually where the execution of movement occurs. So if you were to combine all 3 stages there in the middle, this is what is considered reaction time, or sometimes called reaction interval. This is all the stuff that is going on after a stimulus and before any movement occurs. Reaction time and reaction interval are essentially the same things. They are both the accumulated duration of the 3 stages of processing, after the stimulus and before the movement. Being able to minimize this time is critical to getting the movement underway as rapidly as possible. This is really common in sports. Having a shorter reaction time usually means a greater performance in that sport. Let's look at this example of the runners lining up on the starting block. Here are the sequence of events that are all included in reaction time. The gun goes off. The sound travels from the gun to the ear. Then the ear registers that sound and sends an impulse to the brain. The brain processes that sound, organizes the response, then sends a signal to start running. Finally, the signal is received by the muscles and the athlete actually begins to run. So what's an interesting fact about reaction time is that in sports like track, limits are set on how fast a human can react to a signal. Researchers have determined that a humanly amount of time to respond to a gunshot is between 120 and 130 milliseconds. Setting a limit of what is too fast is how they determine if there's a false start or not. The International Association of Athletics Federation has determined that if an athlete leaves the blocks quicker than 100 milliseconds after the signal, then it is too fast for a normal reaction time and is considered a false start. In the Olympics, the blocks actually each have their own speaker. Why do you think that is? If you remember back from the previous slide, sound has to travel from that gunshot to the ear. And so if there's a larger distance between where the sound occurs and then the athlete, then that duration of time is actually increased. So to minimize that variation, this is where why there are speakers on each block. Also, each block is engineered with pressure sensors to be able to gauge the athlete's reaction time to that sound. So this is how they determine if there was a false start or not. And this precision is extremely important because a lot of races are often won by hundredths of a second. I want you to imagine that you're driving in a car on the interstate with other cars ahead of you. all of a sudden the car in front of you hits their brakes, indicated by the brake lights that you see flash on. So your response is to press your own brakes in order to not hit them from behind. So let's break this scenario down now. What is the stimulus? You'll see this on the left side of this graph. So the stimulus is the brake lights. Now your reaction time is going to be from the point of that stimulus to the point you actually initiate movement to remove your foot from the accelerator. So I want you to remember that this does not include the time it actually takes to complete the movement. This is just what's happening in the information processing stages. So now you are moving your foot from that accelerator to the brake pedal to eventually press it down. Now this part is called the movement time. Now if you were to add the reaction time to the movement time of this action, you would get what's called your response time. Reaction time and response time are often misused in common language, but they actually mean two different things. Reaction time is only the information processing without the movement, and response time is reaction time combined with the time it takes to make that certain movement. So what are some factors that might influence the time it takes for someone to react? First of all, if there are a number of responses available for that specific stimuli, the reaction time will increase, which means essentially get worse. This is called choice reaction time. The performer must choose one response from a whole plethora of predetermined movements. On the flip side, if there's only one or two choices in responses for that given stimulus, then the reaction time will be much shorter or quicker. Second, if there is more than one stimulus that someone must react to, the reaction time will again increase. The increase in reaction time due to the increase in stimuli and the increase in response choices is what is known as Hicks' law. As seen on this figure, if the number of stimulus and response alternatives go up, reaction time will also go up. Another factor influencing reaction time is stimulus-response compatibility. This is basically saying that the more natural or compatible the response is to the stimulus, the shorter the reaction time. The more unnatural or incompatible a response is, the longer the reaction time. Think about driving your car again. If you want to turn your car right, then you turn your steering wheel to the right. If you want to turn your car left, then the steering wheel turns to the left. Imagine what it would be like if you had to turn your steering wheel right to then make your car turn left. Your reaction time would definitely increase. This can of course get better with practice. If you've ever backed up a trailer behind your car before, this is a great example of this incompatibility. To back up your trailer, you have to steer your wheel the opposite direction from where you want the trailer to go. That is why this skill takes practice to be able to do quickly and correctly. So take a look at this image here with the coffee mug. Would it take you longer to grab your coffee mug if the handle was turned to the opposite side of your reaching hand? Yes, it makes it more complicated. And in this image, imagine your stove having 4 burners organized like this. Now, if your dials looked similar, your reaction time on choosing the right one would be much quicker if your dials were organized in a fashion unlike your burners. So all of these examples would be considered spatial mapping. If the response is of the same spatial map or directional map as the stimulus, then your reaction time will be much quicker. Another factor influencing reaction time that is not spatial mapping would be what's called population stereotypes. This is a type of stimulus response compatibility, but it is influenced by your culture and the environment that you learn those responses. An example would be light switches. In the US, we typically press or flip a light switch up to turn the light on, but in Europe, it is often presented as opposite. If we grew up in the US and learned this response stereotype, our reaction time in Europe would be much slower turning on this light switch. And we may even choose the wrong response. A lot of time we don't even realize what our population stereotypes might be until we are in a situation where they're presented as different. A very good example would be driving, say in the UK or New Zealand. In the US, we drive on the right side of the road, but in those two countries, they drive on the left side of the road. So basically, if you end up going from the US to, say, New Zealand to drive, every stimulus presented in driving will require the opposite response than what you are used to. This would increase your reaction time all the time. So population stereotypes are when we act habitually due to specific cultural learning. And if we are presented with a situation where the response should be different, our reaction time will increase. Now, a lot of sports and the level of performance at that sport is determined by reaction time. So what can we do to reduce this reaction time? Anticipation is something that we can do. This is the ability to quickly and accurately predict the outcome of an action before the action is actually completed. Anticipation is preemptively performing some of the information processing stages in advance of the stimulus in order to get to the movement stage as quick as possible. So if someone can predict what the stimulus will be before it happens, then they have already knocked out that amount of time for that stage. Experts at a task have a large advantage over novices because of this perceptual anticipation. Think to yourself of what some examples might be, say in athletics or anything that you do, where you have witnessed this anticipation being successful for that athlete. Anticipation can occur in different ways. Spatial anticipation is when someone predicts where or in what direction the stimulus will occur. An example of this is when a goalie predicts where the opponent will shoot and therefore begins pre-processing that response before the shot actually happens. An experienced goalie will be able to read the movements of their opponent as they set up for a shot better than a novice goalie, and therefore be able to spatially anticipate that opponent's shot. Now, temporal anticipation is when someone predicts when the stimulus will occur. This is what happens when people falsely start a track race. They anticipate when the gunshot will be heard, and therefore they begin to process their response before the stimuli. This usually results in a start off the blocks less than 100 milliseconds, and therefore a false start. So, of course, if someone can anticipate correctly, the result will be beneficial in that it will reduce their reaction time. This can lead to someone possibly starting their responsive movements at the same time as the signal or the stimuli. In sports where there are no limits set on reaction time, this can provide a huge advantage. Experience in the task, as well as knowledge of your opponent's tendencies, affects the ability to anticipate. For instance, in motocross, a lot of gain happens in the corners of the track. If a racer has knowledge of how his opponent rides through the corner, then that racer can anticipate that movement and make a response to overtake them on the inside at just the right time. Anticipation comes with risk. There are quite large costs if you anticipate incorrectly. Let's say the baseball batter anticipates the pitcher is going to throw a fastball. If the pitcher actually throws a curveball, that batter has already initiated their response to swing earlier. This incorrect anticipation will then require even more processing activities to change up the response and therefore end up in a longer delay compared to an unanticipated event. Sometimes anticipating incorrectly can create a biomechanical disadvantage where the response can't even be altered all at once or once it's initiated. An example of a soccer goalie thinking their opponent is going to shoot in one direction, but they actually shoot in the other, is a great example of this incorrect anticipation. If this goalie initiates the movement incorrectly, there may be no going back and the response will be drastically in the wrong direction. In the experienced athlete that is able to anticipate correctly, memory plays a large role of storing that information to be recalled on during that situation. When we go through the process of receiving information, processing that information, then performing the movement, we also go through a feedback process to know if that response was successful or if it needs to be changed. When this process is stored in our memory, the next time the stimulus comes along, we're able to anticipate it, or we can modify the response to the correct one. The feedback that is stored in our memory systems informs our responses in future situations. We actually have 3 distinct memory systems that do this task. One is our short-term sensory store, 2, our short-term memory, and then 3, our long-term memory. Let's start with the short-term sensory store. This is when we sense something, such as see or hear something, but this sense is only held onto for a brief period of time, sometimes only a couple of seconds. For example, let's say we open the fridge to grab something out of it, and in the corner of our eye we see the milk container in there. We close the fridge, go to the cabinet, pull out a glass, then open the fridge back up. Our short-term sensory store has stored briefly where that milk is located, and therefore we can anticipate the direction which we are going to reach for it when we open the fridge again. We spotted the milk earlier, stored the visual memory for a few seconds, then was able to anticipate a movement on the second time around. Short-term memory is actually something different than your short-term sensory store. This is still temporary, just like the short-term sensory store, but it isn't only sensory. An example is trying to remember a phone number someone just told you. We know that if you don't write this number down or rehearse this number, we will only remember it for a few minutes, sometimes even seconds. That's short-term memory. To retain things stored in your short-term memory and log them away in your long-term memory, you have to rehearse them. This rehearsal is giving that information enough attention for it to then be recalled on later. For instance, if you were to be told a phone number, then immediately distracted, the likelihood of you being able to recall that information is very low. So think about this when you're listening to a lecture, or when you're listening to someone talk. If the information you hear is given little attention at the time, it goes into short-term memory and is quickly lost. Giving that information a lot of attention and even rehearsal is how you move it into your long-term memory and therefore are able to recall it at a later time. And now we have our long-term memory. Our long-term memory is essentially limitless in its capacity, and it contains the information that we have put effort into retaining, as well as the meaningful memories we have collected over our lifetime. Sometimes, however, this information may not be accessible to recall instantaneously. For example, when we forget the name of a longtime friend or where they live, the information is in there, but it has temporary times of inaccessibility and therefore takes a bit of effort to recall. Researchers suggest that the information stored in our long-term memory is very abstract and has elaborate connections to other stored information. If we rehearse and connect the information in our short-term memory, then it becomes stored in our long-term memory. If you've experienced when you hear a song from the past and it brings up memories or feelings from the past, you've experienced this example of elaborate connections that we have in our long-term memory. It would be hard to just come up with that feeling or that memory on our own, but the trigger of the song makes it possible. Long-term memory also contains procedural memory skills. These are the skills that we just know how to do that don't take conscious thought. Riding a bicycle is an example of a procedural memory skill. Remember in the chapter when we classified skills into discrete and continuous, researchers showed that continuous skills, like running or riding a bike, are retained longer than discrete skills such as throwing a dart or doing some sort of gymnastics trick. Here's a figure to help you remember the different systems that hold our information and play a part in our ability to react to stimuli. In our short-term sensory store, the information is mostly sensory and is lost immediately if it's not used right away. Short-term memory will contain information, not just sensory, for about 10 to 20 seconds unless it's rehearsed. Being distracted right after obtaining this information will reduce that amount of time. And then the long-term memory can be cognitive as well as motor and is basically limitless in its capacity. However, because of its elaborate and abstract connections, sometimes recalling this information from this store can take some effort. So this concludes the lecture on processing information and making decisions, chapter 2 of the Schmidt and Lee readings. Please email me if you have any questions about any of this material that I covered.